Okay, let's dive right into this. If you're a beginner law student, or frankly just someone curious about how the legal world handles civil wrongs, you're in the right place. Today, we are going to completely unpack the anatomy of a tort in this explainer on foundational legal concepts. It's going to be a fun one.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to quickly define what a tort actually is, break down its essential elements, see how it compares to other legal wrongs, and then get into some really interesting stuff like strict and vicarious liability. Finally, we'll wrap up with the legal shields or defenses and how courts go about righting the wrong with remedies.
All right, part one. What is a tort? Let's establish the absolute basics of civil wrongs.
So, believe it or not, the word tort actually comes from the Latin word tortum, which literally translates to twisted. Makes sense, right? A tort is essentially behavior that is just twisted. It's crooked. It goes against the acceptable rules of society. In legal terms, it's a civil wrong where someone hurts another person's legal rights, and the fix, what we call the remedy, is filing a lawsuit to get undetermined damages. Now, undetermined basically just means financial compensation that a court decides on later, completely based on the very specific facts of that unique case.
Moving right along to Section 2, the essential elements. This is basically the formula for a tort. Now, anytime you're looking at a real-world situation and evaluating a potential tort, you literally have to check these three specific boxes. Step 1, there's got to be a wrongful act or an omission. That means failing to do something you explicitly had a legal duty to do. And it has to be legally improper, okay? Not just morally or socially frowned upon. Step 2, this wrongful act has to directly cause damage to another person. And finally, Step 3, that damage must trigger a legal right for the injured party to sue for a remedy. This strict three-step formula, that is the absolute bedrock of all tortious liability. Okay, here's where things get really fascinating. Let's look at the Latin phrase injuria sine damnum, which translates to injury without damage. Imagine your legal rights are violated, but, you haven't actually lost a single dime or suffered a scratch. Is that still a tort? Yes, absolutely. It is an actionable tort. There's this famous case, Ashby v. White, all the way back from 1702. A voter was wrongly denied his right to cast a ballot. Now, his guy ended up winning anyway, so he suffered zero actual loss, right? Well, the court basically said it doesn't matter. The right to vote is an absolute legal right, and violating it is a twisted act, a tort, period. So it goes to show that your legal rights have absolute value, even if your wallet is totally unaffected.
But let's flip that over instantly and look at damnum sine injuria. This is an actual loss, but without any injury to a legal right. And guess what? This is not an actionable tort. Think about the classic Gloucester grammar school case. The plaintiff owned a school, and the defendant decided to set up a rival school literally right next door, charging lower fees. Naturally, the plaintiff lost a ton of students and bled a lot of money. But the court stepped in and said, hey, sorry, this just isn't a tort. The new owner was simply exercising their own legal right to run a business. So yeah, it might be terrible for your blood pressure and your bank account, but because no actual legal rights were broken, no tort. Simple as that.
Let's jump into Section 3, Torts versus Other Wrongs. It's time to draw the lines, because comparing concepts is the best way to really understand them. First up, how does a tort differ from a crime? Well, in a tort, which again is a civil wrong, the spotlight is almost entirely on the victim. The main goal here is compensation. We want to put the victim back, as closely as humanly possible, to the position they were in before the whole twisted thing happened. And that's usually done through those undetermined damages decided by a judge. A crime, on the other hand, is a public wrong. The focus shifts from the victim to society as a whole stepping in to punish the offender. That means fixed penalties, like fines paid directly to the state or even mandatory jail time.
Next, let's look at torts versus a breach of contract. A super relatable analogy here is thinking of a contract as breaking a very specific promise you made to a very specific person. The duties in a contract are fixed entirely by the two parties who willingly shook hands on it. But a tort? A tort is breaking a rule that society made for literally everyone. The duties are fixed by the law itself, and you owe those duties to the general public. Kind of like your duty to drive carefully so you don't hit a random pedestrian crossing the street.
All right, Section 4, strict and vicarious liability. This is the big plot twist of tort law, when it's not exactly your fault.
Honestly, just think about this question for a second. Can you actually be sued and forced to pay out of pocket for a mistake that somebody else made? At first glance, that sounds completely unfair, doesn't it? Well, spoiler alert, under the law of torts, the answer is sometimes a resounding yes.
And that brings us right into vicarious liability. This is when you are held legally responsible for the torts of another person entirely because of a special relationship you have with them. The classic example is the old master and servant dynamic, which today we just call employer and employee. It's built on a rule called respondeat superior, which basically means let the superior be responsible. Imagine a bus company hires a driver, and that driver recklessly crashes the bus while on the clock. The bus company, the employer, has to pay up. Why? Because they gave the employee the authority to do the job in the first place, so they take the heat when it all goes sideways.
Which brilliantly sets up our next massive concept, strict liability. This means you are liable for damages if something dangerous escapes your land, even if you took every single precaution and were 0% negligent. The landmark case here is Rylands v. Fletcher. So the defendant built a reservoir on his land, but water escaped through these secret ancient mine shafts nobody even knew existed, and it completely flooded his neighbor's coal mine. Was the defendant negligent? Not at all. But the court basically said, too bad. If you bring a hazard onto your property and it gets out and wreaks havoc, you are strictly liable. You pay the damages. End of story.
So, how do defendants protect themselves? Section 5, Defenses and Exceptions. Let's look at the legal shields. Okay, let's run through a few of the primary legal shields you can use. A major one is consent, or volenti non fit injuria. A quick example, if you willingly strap on some pads, step onto a football field, and get violently tackled, you cannot sue for battery. You consented to the inherent risks of the game. Other shields include an act of God, which is an unpredictable, totally freak natural event, along with necessity, where you cause a tiny bit of harm to prevent a massive disaster, self-defense, and acting under statutory authority.
But the really crucial one to grasp here is contributory negligence. This kicks in when the plaintiff, the person who got hurt, is actually partially to blame for their own injury. So say you get hit by a speeding car. The driver was definitely negligent, but you were hit while jaywalking in the middle of a pitch-black road wearing all black clothing. The court isn't going to completely toss out your case, but they will absolutely split the blame. If they decide you were, say, 40% responsible for what happened, your damages get slashed by 40%. You only get paid for the portion of the fault that squarely belongs to the defendant.
Let's bring it all home with Section 6, Righting the Wrong, Fixing the Problem.
You're going to hear this famous legal maxim a lot, ubi jus ibi remedium. Where there is a right, there is a remedy. Essentially, having a shiny legal right on paper is completely and utterly useless if you don't have a way to actually enforce it. The whole entire purpose of tort law is to provide that exact remedy when your rights get trampled on. So, what do these remedies look like in practice? Well, the most common fix, by far, is damages. Financial compensation to try and make you whole again. But sometimes throwing money at a problem just doesn't cut it. In those scenarios, a court might issue an injunction. This is a direct, legally binding order telling someone to stop doing something, like forcing your neighbor to stop blasting heavy metal at 3 a.m., or telling them they must perform a specific act. Finally, you have a specific restitution, which is exactly what it sounds like. Simply getting your wrongfully taken property handed back to you.
Which leaves us with this final kind of provocative thought to chew on. We know courts award these undetermined damages to try and magically put victims back exactly where they started, but how exactly does a judge put a fair, calculated monetary price tag on something totally invisible, something like severe mental trauma or a completely ruined reputation? It's honestly one of the most complex, fascinating challenges in the entire legal system, and it's exactly the kind of deep puzzle you'll be grappling with as you continue your journey into torts. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.